Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us from the True Stories collection. Amy plays the One Ring and passes the turn without making any mention of its enters the battlefield ability. Then, Nick plays a Suncleanser and says that he wants to remove all counters from Amy. Amy sets her energy total to 0, and Nick goes on with his turn. Sometime later, the players realize that if Amy had protection from everything, she would not have been a legal target for the Suncleanser's ability, and they call for a judge. What is the appropriate infraction, penalty, and fix? Okay, we'll start by identifying the infraction because that will determine what the penalty and the fix should be. In order to do that, we need to pinpoint the first time that a player did something against the rules. Your first impulse might be to say that this would be when Nick tried to target Amy with Suncleanser's ability, and indeed, it is not legal to target a player who has protection from everything. But there's a little nuance here that we need to be careful of. Unlike poker and some other kinds of trading card games, there is no concept of card speak in Magic when it comes to triggered abilities. That is, triggered abilities do not automatically go on the stack, resolve, or otherwise affect the game at all unless someone points them out. The reasons for this are partially historical and have evolved over the years of Magic tournaments into the policy that we have today. For more information on the history of this policy, you can check out my video on the history of policy changes. And for a fuller discussion on some of those philosophical aspects, I recommend my video titled How to Rules Lawyer Your Opponent, Step-by-Step Guide. For now, let's apply that information to the situation presented in the original problem statement. How do we know if Amy's trigger was missed? In general, a triggered ability must be pointed out the first time that it affects the visible game state. Magic's policy documents outline several possibilities for various types of triggers, but this triggered ability, the time that it has to be noticed corresponds to any time something that would be illegal if the ability resolves is happening in the game. This gives us the answer to our original question. Since Amy did not communicate anything about the One Ring's trigger by this time, we can say that Amy has missed her trigger. This being the case, there is nothing illegal about Nick's Suncleanser play, so Amy would stay at 0 energy and cannot gain any more until the Suncleanser leaves the battlefield. There's no penalty for Amy because this trigger is not normally detrimental to her, and Nick would have the option of whether to put this trigger on the stack at the point that the error was discovered, but only if the players noticed this sometime within a turn of when the trigger should have happened based on what was actually happening in the game. Okay, so up until now, I've been working under the assumption that both players legitimately forgot about the triggered ability, and that's a very plausible assumption to make even at the Pro Tour. Turns out being very good at a game doesn't mean that you never make mistakes or focus on the wrong thing. Heck, there's no reason to think that they wouldn't have worded this heretofore unplayable bulk rare's ability such that it didn't target at all and instead infected each opponent. But still, if there were such a thing to happen at a high-stakes game, there would almost certainly be people wondering if there was a chance that maybe Nick might have known the One Ring trigger should have happened and just didn't say anything. Well, the way that Magic's policy documents are worded, though, this is irrelevant. Nick does not need to demonstrate awareness of this trigger. Amy does. Nick can point it out if he likes, but he is not obligated to. This is in contrast to other types of infractions which must be brought up as soon as they're noticed. There is a special exception for mistriggered abilities where you are allowed to let your opponent miss them. I don't purport to be an expert on the topic of ethics or morality, so I'll make no comment on that front except to say that from the players' descriptions, it seemed that both of the players really actually did forget about it. In any case, if I was in a game with thousands of dollars on the line, I can't say I wouldn't use every tactic available, even if the sportsmanship aspect got a little bit murky. Again, if you're interested in the historical reasoning behind that part of Magic's missed trigger policy, I recommend those videos I mentioned earlier. But the short version is that, psychologically, many tournament Magic players consider missing a triggered ability more akin to not casting a spell or not using an activated ability, rather than creating an illegal game state. Another question that I saw brought up is, shouldn't the judges have caught this? And there certainly was a judge sitting right there while this was going on who could have stepped in. But there's a couple of important things to note here. First of all, remember, no one had even heard of this card before the Pro Tour. When I'm watching a match and I see a player make a play with a card I've never seen before, my first impulse is to assume that the player knows what their own card does better than I do, not to stop the match so that I can read the card. Which is pretty much generally regarded as the correct thing to do, especially if we're talking about a feature match where stopping play would mean delaying the online broadcast. Second, remember that the infraction here is that Amy missed her the One Ring trigger. Judges do not intervene in cases of a missed trigger unless they intend to issue a penalty or have reason to believe that a player missed the trigger intentionally. So if someone missed a trigger that was detrimental to them, that would be a warning, so you would stop the game there. Or maybe if we were talking about like a Dark Confidant trigger where its controller was at a low life, then it might be reasonable to suspect that the player could be trying to gain an advantage by missing this trigger intentionally. So maybe you would want to stop the game and investigate that possibility. But for this case, I think we can all agree there's no reasonable explanation for Amy not to want this trigger to happen, so it's safe to say that she just forgot about it. So let's recap. Amy missed the One Rings trigger that gives her protection from everything. She won't get a penalty because that trigger is generally good for her. Nick doesn't get a penalty even if he noticed that Amy missed her trigger, because if your opponent misses a trigger, you don't have to remind them. And if a judge saw that happen, the correct thing for the judge to do would be to not intervene. Now, there still is another kind of interesting loose end to tie up here. What would happen if Amy didn't miss her trigger? We said that Amy does not need to demonstrate awareness of this triggered ability until the first time that it would affect the visible game state, and that's when Nick tried to target Amy. Alright, well, what would happen if Amy had said she had protection from everything at that point? Well, first off, Nick still would not be getting a penalty. Obviously, if Amy has protection from everything and Nick tried to target her with something, that would be against the rules. In normal circumstances, attempting to make such a play would be a game rule violation, but this is a little bit of a special case. In the situation described in the original problem statement, there was no penalty for Nick, even though he made the exact same play. Wouldn't it be weird for him to get a penalty here where we have the exact same thing going on? So the policy that governs this sort of thing says that Nick is allowed to proceed as though the triggered ability has been missed. If his play goes through with no objection from Amy, that means that she missed the trigger and the game continues, which is exactly the case from the original problem statement. If the triggered ability's controller notes the trigger at that time, then the trigger obviously is not missed. So what happens then is that the play gets rewound. I talked about this as well as some of the other relevant ramifications in my video on missing the One Rings trigger, so you can check that out if you'd like more details about that specific situation. Now, usually rewinding the play is pretty straightforward, but here there's a little bit of an interesting question of what point you should rewind to. I think most people would intuitively expect that casting Suncleanser was part of the play that Nick made, but there was nothing illegal about that. Rather, attempting to put Suncleanser's ability on the stack with a mode that targets Amy would be the first time someone tried to make a game decision that was not possible given the game state. Therefore, that would be a spot that a judge would back up to most likely. And I say most likely because there are some of my colleagues that might disagree with this logic and back the Suncleanser up also, since it is part of the same logical block of actions, but I think that would be a minority position. Given that we are rewinding only the Suncleanser's ability, let's take a look at what that would look like. Observe that the second mode of this ability says target opponent. It is not possible to choose this mode if your opponent has hexproof. That would mean that Nick would be forced to choose the other mode and Suncleanse all the counters off of a creature. This means there is an element of risk for Nick if he plays the Suncleanser and Amy does remember her One Ring trigger. If she remembers it, Nick just blew his high impact sideboard card for no value. There's a lot of potential upside too, though. If Suncleanser's ability goes through targeting Amy, that's a big swing for Nick. Officially, once the One Rings trigger is missed like this, it can't be unmissed unless Nick allows it. If he doesn't, that would mean that he could attack Amy and damage her this turn because she doesn't have protection at all. Rulings like this one tend to be pretty controversial, and it's easy to see why. Even though it seemed like both players legitimately forgot about the One Rings trigger in the case that actually happened, there's no way to know that for sure, and the stakes are pretty high in terms of impact to the game. Unfortunately, this is one area where the existing policy doesn't cover in a really satisfying way, which leads to a lot of potential for angle shooting, whether or not it was intentional. Indeed, normally, policy tries to incentivize players to communicate as clearly as possible, but here, from a game theoretical standpoint, neither player is incentivized to speak up. So, to close out, let's take a short look at how this scenario might be handled at regular Rel. Obviously, things are going to be a little bit different on the Pro Tour than at an FNM, but I think it makes a lot of sense to look at competitive and professional fixes as a starting point for regular events. And likewise, the fixes that we implement at regular events are a great starting point for policy writers looking to make Magic's rules line up with the best possible player experience. So if this came up at a regular event that I was judging, I would probably rule that the One Rings trigger should have been considered to have resolved, if we caught this during the same turn that Amy would have protection. I would probably allow Nick to undo the whole casting of Suncleanser if this was the case. If the players didn't notice until after the One Ring's protection would have worn off, I would probably rule just like discussed earlier. The game state is so far past the point of the error that attempting to correct things would probably just make it worse. Therefore, there would be no backing up or trying to fix anything. Just continue the game. And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another Daily Ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.